Hello, 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 everyone. You are most welcome to today's virtual plenary session with myself and the former Prime Minister, the 27th Prime Minister of Australia, and also the first woman to have served in that position, the only one to date, and also Deputy Prime Minister, the only woman to have served in that position. I am coming to you live from London. And so for me, it is good morning, but of course it is good afternoon to those of you who are physically in Kigali. It is good evening if you're in Hong Kong or New Delhi. It is good morning, a very early morning for those of you in New York. And of course, the people who are joining us from so many parts of the world. I cannot begin to express my thanks to you all for just making the time to be with us virtually today. And I'm excited for the conversation that is going to ensue, and I know you are too. So just so that I get us started onto a session, which, so that you understand what's going to happen, is I'm going to have a little introduction and session. And so the larger part of the conversation will be spent with the Honorable Julia Gillard sharing with us a number of her thoughts and reflections in a conversation that I know you will enjoy. And of course, we'll have the last part of this session opened to the floor, because she came ready to engage with you as well. She came ready to respond to you. And of course, this is an opportunity for you to draw from the well and the wealth of knowledge that she is, and experience, of course. And so just before I do that, can I explain the format? So I will just be, that's what's going to happen in terms of the general structure. But of course, you, in terms of asking your questions, sharing your comments, there should be a comment section icon that you should be able to see on your screen, and that is where, and the Q&A, it's a Q&A icon. So you should be able to ask your questions through that, and they will be fed back to me. I'll be able to field them, and she will give us a good response to the best of her ability. And you're welcome to be as open and forthcoming as you wish, but of course with respect. There is also an interpretation icon in French, Spanish, and international sign language provided. If you're not able to see it, please refresh your browser and it should be able to show up. So without further ado, my name is Natasha Muhoza. I am a proud Rwandan woman. I am a creative artist, a writer, spoken word poet, storyteller, a lawyer, and an online talk show host with the show Kick It with Muhoza, which is primarily on Instagram, and an advocate for women's rights, mental health generally. I'm a lover of life, learning, travel, fitness. And so I'm excited to bring to you a phenomenal powerhouse, trailblazer, devoted leader, foresighted thinker, community-oriented woman who is Madam Julia Gillard. I cannot express fully how joyful I am to be able to have this conversation with you. If I may ask quickly, how would you prefer that I address you in this conversation? Is Honorable Gillard just fine? Is Miss Julia okay? Can I just invite you to yeah?
Please, Natasha, it's great to be with you. I'm delighted to be joining this session, and please just call me Julia.
Oh, right. Thank you. Thank you for that. It will be a bit tough for me because, coming from an African background, just using first name basis with people who are so much more senior in age and in experience is difficult. But thank you for granting me that that permission. Julia was sworn in as the 27th Prime Minister of Australia on June 24th, 2010, and served in that office until June 2013. As Prime Minister in her previous role as Deputy Prime Minister, she was central to the successful management of Australia's economy, the 13th biggest in the world, and during the global financial crisis. And as Australia positioned itself to seize the benefits of Asia's rise, Ms. Gillard delivered nation-changing policies, including reforming Australian education at every level, from early childhood to university. And she creating an emissions trading scheme, improving the provision of and sustainability of healthcare, aged care, and dental care, commencing the nation's first ever national scheme to care for people with disabilities, and restructuring the telecommunications sector, as well as building the national broadband network. In foreign policy, Julia strengthened Australia's alliance with the United States, secured a stronger architecture for the relationship with China, upgraded Australia's ties with India, and deepened ties with Japan, Indonesia, and South Korea. She represented Australia at various global summits, including the G20, the East Asia Summit, APEC, NATO, ISAF, and even chaired a Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. Under her leadership, her able leadership, I must add, Australia was elected to serve on the United Nations Security Council. And as Prime Minister, she developed Australia's guiding policy paper, Australia in the Asian Century. Julia is the first woman to ever have served as Australia's Prime Minister or Deputy Prime Minister. In October 2012, something ground shifting happened. She received worldwide attention from her speech in Parliament on the treatment of women in professional and public life. It is quite the speech. Those of you who have not yet had a moment to sit down and watch it, I will tell you, it is something you will not regret doing. Yes, so in 2014, she was appointed chair of the Global Partnership for Education, a leading organization dedicated to expanding access and quality education worldwide. She also serves as the patron of CAMFED, the Campaign for Female Education, which takes poverty and inequality by supporting girls to go to school and succeed, and empowering young women to step up as leaders of change. In April 2018, she was appointed inaugural chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College, which is also an institute she founded. Through research, practice, and advocacy, the institute is addressing women's underrepresentation in leadership, the way gender negatively impacts women leaders. A sister institute has also been launched at the Australian National University. In October 2022, Julia was appointed to lead South Australia's Royal Commission into Early Childhood Education and Care. The Royal Commission's line of inquiry includes how families are supported in the first 1,000 days of a child's life, how universal quality preschool programs can be delivered, how all families can access out of school hours care, and the benefits of increasing workforce participation from parents through improved access to care. She is a distinguished fellow with the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution in Washington. She serves as honorary professor at the University of Adelaide and is patron of the John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library in Perth, Western Australia. She is patron of Western Chances, which provides scholarships to help young people in Melbourne's West who are facing barriers in achieving their potential. She's a founding patron of A Monument of One's Own, a community campaign for more statues of Australian women. And she's also a patron of the Museum of Australian Democracy in Canberra, a living museum of the nation's social and political history. She is also a patron of the Mackinnon Prize, an independent nonpartisan award that acknowledges outstanding political leadership. In all of that, and in addition to all of that, she's also a podcaster. I learned of her podcast not so long ago, but I'm so glad I did. Her podcast is called A Podcast of One's Own with Julia Gillard. Please get your phones, download that the podcast, and please get into the conversations that she has been having with women across sectors, across fields, across various countries as well. She has authored 3 books. The first one is titled My Story. It details it details her time as Prime Minister. The second one is Women and Leadership: Real Lives, Real Lessons, which she co-authored with another great woman, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Her third book, which is the subject of our discussion today, is Not Now, Not Ever: 10 years from the misogyny speech. It was published in 2022, and more than a decade on from this speech that stopped people in their tracks. The book asks, where were you then? And where are we today? With contributions from others, including Mary Baird, Kathy Leet, and Global Institute for Women's Leadership. It explores the history and culture of misogyny and the roadmap for the future. It points out very poignantly some of the problems that exist, some of the existing attitudes around women in leadership, how, from the media, from an intersectionality point of view, from another, fellow leadership, people who have, who shared their insights on where they were, how they perceived the speech, and of course, Julia's own voice in, just that day in the hours leading up to when she did make that fantastic speech, and even after, what has ensued, what her reflections have become over the years, meeting young people, young activists who have shared their thoughts as well. And so it's a brilliant opportunity that we have today to just reflect alongside Julia herself. So welcome. So just without further ado, I would love to pass you the mic and just for you to tell us about this title, Not Now, Not Ever. I would like, of course, I and many others in the room and online in the virtual room would like to know more. Why did you choose this title? If you could walk us through your personal journey in terms of, your reflections on misogyny, how did you arrive at this title?
Thank you very much, and thank you for that very generous introduction. Not Now, Not Ever, I think, is in many ways a cry of frustration and also a cry of how we want to change our world. I hope it encapsulates for women that we're over it. We no longer want to live in a gender unequal world, and we want to be engaged in all of the changes necessary to make sure that in the future we can live free of this kind of prejudice and discrimination, and in fact free of all kinds of prejudice and discrimination. So the title actually comes from the opening words of my misogyny speech in the Australian Parliament in 2010. And in brief, the lead up to that speech was, I became Prime Minister, first woman to serve, and I became Prime Minister in 2010. Sorry, the speech was in 2012. And when I became Prime Minister in 2010, I thought to myself, yes, there will be a reaction to me being the first woman. There's no doubt about that. And some of that reaction will be very positive. A lot of women who think, you know, you go girl, it's great to see that a woman's finally got there. But I also expected there to be a negative reaction. Some people who were very used to traditional faces of male leadership thinking to themselves, oh, I'm not quite comfortable with this. But I expected that as I governed, as I was Prime Minister, then those initial reactions would fall away and I would just be judged on the basis of the job I was doing. Kind of naive looking back on it in retrospect, but that's what I thought at the time. And what I actually found, though, was that the gendered reactions didn't fall away. Actually, they got worse and worse and worse, and the sort of go-to political weapon became a gendered insult. And then on that day in Parliament, because of a set of parliamentary circumstances, the opposition was going to try and suggest that I was someone who hadn't been consistent in terms of being opposed to sexism. And so you can imagine, after putting up with all of this, not calling it out, not naming it, you know, to end up being accused of being the one who supported sexism just seemed to me a huge injustice. And when I went into the Parliament, I was expecting it to be the ordinary rhythm of question time. I would get asked questions, I would answer them. But what happened instead was the opposition moved to have an immediate debate. So what has become known as the misogyny speech is my speech in that debate. I didn't prepare it, I just gave it off the cuff. And I think the line that came to me first was, I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man, the leader of the opposition, not now, not ever. And I think, you know, that phrase, not now, not ever, has stayed with me and for many women that I've talked to about the battles we still need to fight, that sense that we want to draw the line, not now, not ever, draw the line on sexism and gender inequality. I think the words capture that spirit.
And that is absolutely just beautiful to reflect on, because it indeed draws the line. You know, even as you read, one reads the reflections on that speech, you just, there's this not now, not ever is almost the imaginary border between what we are tired of experiencing and we want to see a change of into, you know, between the past and the future of what we want the women's experiences to be. So thank you for that contribution to women's to, you know, a historical moment in history of women's leadership. And of course that makes me just wonder, why is it important for women and girls across the world, especially those in leadership, to stop and put aside, you know, all these things that we are always distracted by and reflect? You know, it's easy to go through the motions, to simply say, you know what, any misogyny we experience will just go away at some point. Let's just keep doing what we do, because that is in many ways what we women tend to do. But why is it important, in your opinion, for us to stop, to seriously reflect on a moment like this, that one in history, but also generally every once in a while, in terms of what we may be doing to either perpetuate misogyny or to try and stop it in its tracks?
Yeah, I think you've caught something really important with this question, which is, you know, we're all busy, you know, busy leading our lives, busy pursuing the causes that are important to us. You know, there are so many pressures on women at all stages of life, but particularly on women who also have family obligations, whether that be the care of children, whether it be the care of older relatives, or whether it be both at the same time, trying to manage it all. And I think in those circumstances, you can just get so caught up in, you know, getting it done another day, getting it done another day. And I felt a lot like that during the days of my prime ministership. I knew however long I was prime minister, it wasn't going to be forever. So I had this sense of not a minute to waste. You know, you want to make sure every minute is having the most impact for the future. And when you're doing that, you know, and the misogyny and the sexism comes, it can be easy to think, look, the thing I should just do is not be distracted by that. I should just barrel on through because what I'm doing is important. But if we all do that, then it means that the misogyny is never called out. It's never held up to the light. We don't talk about it. And most importantly of all, we don't talk about the most effective ways of stopping it. And so once I'd given the misogyny speech, you know, and in the years since my time in politics, one of the things that I've most wanted to do, and it's led me to founding the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, is to bring us together to say, let's hold this up to the light, misogyny and sexism, and let's do the research necessary so we've got the best strategies, the most evidence-based strategies for ending it. And as we talk about in the book, you know, misogyny in some ways is as old as time. Mary Beard, the classicist, goes back thousands of years for us and talks about misogyny then. But it's also as new as this moment, because the way in which misogyny turns up in the modern world is different. You know, it's in the online environment. It's through toxic influencers who are peddling a version of masculinity that is about the subjugation of women. It's about the hate that women receive in the online environment. And yet the traditional forms of misogyny haven't gone away. So the laws that hold women back, the lack of reproductive choices, the lack of representation in structures of power, our physical insecurity, the fact that women still face violence, gender-based violence right around the world. So it's complicated because misogyny shows up in so many ways. And that's another reason that we have to stop and reflect, because when we're trying to combat misogyny and sexism, it's pernicious. And if you crack down on it here, it's got a way of coming there. And it's only by the exchanges and knowing about each other's lived experiences that we can see the whole landscape of what needs to be changed.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think you paint a beautiful picture of actually what is at stake if we all don't stop to reflect every once in a while, and or even as often as actually we possibly can, just because if we all don't do that work, then nothing gets done to help us and the generations of women that will come after us. But also, it's about understanding the reality, understanding, ridding ourselves of the naivety and maybe some innocence within which we come into the world, or we seek to serve in our different capacities. And it's just beautiful what you say, how you paint that picture, to say there's so much at stake, and it is worth our while to invest our energies in that. And if you, I love how you just point the contrast. It's not, really you show the permanence of how misogyny has permeated all our lives, from time immemorial to the modern days of tweets and all that social media brings with it. There's been such great progress that's been made, but so much still remains to be done. And these spaces, the digital spaces, are now the new frontier in which we then have to combat this thing that pops up everywhere when you try to put it down. But that just means we have to keep going. We have to, and I think that's what I hear you telling us across the world. And so I guess let's just get back deeper into the day that the speech was delivered on 9th October 2012. It was such an incisive moment, but you seemed very calm, very deliberate with your words, and yet emphatic in a way, as if saying to the world, I am here and I'm going to speak it, and you are going to listen. Whether you may not change, but you will listen. And this is the it was such a powerful thing for me to just to watch you in action. I do know you have not watched yourself in action, but I also love that fact. I love the fact that for you, it is about, you know, having just your memory and your reflections on that day. And so I guess let's go into that Julia's perspective. How, you know, did you wake up ready to make such a statement? You did hint on it earlier, but if you could, you know, just say a bit of that a little more. And what was at the back of your mind? Of course, you were, you know, getting all this backlash around, you know, the accusations that were being made against you. But then what did you want to achieve in that moment? And what were you hoping you had communicated to the world?
Sure. In some ways, this is a journey measured in years, and in other ways, it's a journey measured in moments. I mean, the bit that's measured in years is, you know, by the time I gave the misogyny speech, I had been in the federal parliament for, you know, more than a decade. You know, I have lots of women come up to me and say, I could never speak like that. I could never make a speech like that. And I'm always very quick to reassure them, you know, in many ways, these are learned skills. You know, on my first day in Parliament, I couldn't have given a speech like that. But over the years of being in Parliament, and the Australian Parliament is a very tough political contest. It's sort of known globally for very, very, very robust exchanges. You know, over the years, you hone your ability without notice to get on your feet and to give a speech, and to give a speech with power and force, and even to do that while people are yelling at you and trying to interject. That's a skill you can hone. And I think that that's shown in the misogyny speech, the fact that, you know, I was a parliamentarian who had been there a while. It's a speech measured in moments, in the sense that I didn't know I was going to give it until, you know, the leader of the opposition jumped up, started a debate, and I only had the amount of time that he was speaking to scribble down some notes and to then get to my feet and give it. And I felt, you know, I had felt as I got ready for what I thought was going to be question time, and I thought the theme of question time was going to be sexism. So I had, you know, across the morning in the lead up to that parliamentary session, I had, you know, got this sense of huge frustration that after everything that I had put up with, gender-based insults, misogyny and the like, that I was now going to find myself in this sort of ridiculous position of being accused of sexism. So I had this sort of itchy frustration. And in the lead up to going to the parliamentary chamber, it really gave way to a kind of cool anger that, you know, this isn't right, it isn't fair, and basically I've had enough of this, the sexism and misogyny, and women have had enough of this. And so I was taking that energy into what I thought was question time. And then I used that energy when it all changed and it became about giving a speech. And I say it was the work of moments, because if you said to me a month before, a fortnight before, a week before, you know, on this day, can you give a speech on misogyny? I couldn't have given that speech. I would have given a prepared speech, a different speech. And I think one of the things that makes it so obviously powerful is that it's clearly done in the flow. And I felt very much in the flow. And so, you know, I knew after I gave it that it had been a speech with force in it, because, you know, you're actually very close to each other in the parliamentary chamber in Australia's national parliament. And the opposition had gone from kind of yelling insults at me to sort of dropping their heads, because they knew that this was a forceful speech. But I had no sense when I finished giving it that it would resonate beyond the parliamentary chamber, let alone that we would be talking about it all of these years later.
Yeah, and I quite remember just recently at the Sydney Writers' Festival, you reflected on when you realized, the moment you realized it was a big thing, is when I think you'd landed, was it in India? where the policewoman turned and said, "Great speech." And then it dawned on you how far and wide the speech had traveled, and not just traveled, but resonated to women of different, economic and social divides. And so I thank you for that, just that reflection of that, of that moment and day. It seems to me that it was an ultimate show of your skill, your even just the patience with which you had packaged your frustrations and all the different experiences you'd had prior to that speech, and sort of delivered them very, very poignantly to the world, really, not just to the Australian public, and to young women in Australia as well. It speaks so much, it speaks volumes about just your capabilities and the way that you were able to speak on such an issue that is close to so many women's hearts. And I think that just does for us what not so many people in history get to do. You coined a space for us. You created a space for us at the table to begin to speak, to begin to think around this issue so seriously. And so, you will go down in history for that. And it's just a joy to be able to note that for you. If I may just pause really quickly and to announce to those of you who are following, this is, I think, already we are at a point in the conversation where, I know some questions are brewing. I know some thoughts and comments are coming through. Please send them through the question and answer icon that you should be able to see on your screen. And back to you, Julia. You led Australia 2010 to 2013 as Prime Minister, first and only woman, Deputy Prime Minister 2007, 2010. The UK, just for context, countries like the UK waited 300 years in order to have its woman. And in fact, she also lends her voice in the book, which is a beautiful reflection, which, I would be able to read a little quote from her. Canada had their first and only 30 years ago, which is as old as I am, which is mind-blowing to think about. USA waited 2,033 years for its first woman, vice president, not even a head of government. And so it's wild in modern language to think about. But in your view, based on your journey, how do we account for this? These are, some of the, the biggest nations of the world, the Western democracies, the rest of the world is meant to or supposed to look up to. Is it the capacity of women in these countries that just has not, allowed them to reach that level? Is it their failure to rise and be counted? Is it that men won't vote for them? Is this sort of phenomenon just inherent in these political systems that, they are where they are in terms of their development, but then women are also where they are in their advancement into leadership and taking up space? How do we make sense of all of this?
Yeah, that's a big question and a very good question. I mean, the perspective I take on it is it's not about any, inherent characteristics in women. It's not about women's confidence or women's intelligence or women's capacity for leadership. I believe women have got those things. I think it can be best described as about the structures and the stereotypes. So the power structures in societies, in democracies, in business, in law, and the list goes on, the media. The power structures are power structures that were built at a time when it was men who were accessing those power structures, and they were built to replicate men's lives, not women's lives. And so, you know, the assumption in politics in Australia for many, many years would have been that men went into politics. It's a big nation. If you're an Australian politician, you've got to travel constantly. The national capital is probably a number of hours travel from where you and your family live. And this works because the men go to Parliament and the man has got a non-working or perhaps part-time working wife at home who's doing everything else. And so the whole structure of the place was built around men's lives. And, you know, women have had to fight for change to have any sense that these structures could be built around women's lives. In the Australian Parliament, I think a nice snapshot that tells you about that change is a bar in Parliament House, what used to be called the non-members bar, where people went to drink alcohol, has now been repurposed as a childcare centre. So I think that's giving you, and I can assure you they are not serving alcohol to the children. That's not happening. It's a proper childcare. It's a proper childcare centre. But, you know, there was no space in Parliament where a politician or a staff member working for a politician or someone who works in Parliament House who had very young children could have them cared for while they were working. And so, you know, structures have had to be changed. And then stereotypes have had to be changed too. So, you know, the truth is, in many parts of the world, in almost every part of the world, if you ask people to close their eyes and imagine a prime minister, a president, they would probably imagine a man, you know, in a suit, or depending which country they come from, they might imagine someone in the sort of national dress that goes with that country, but they would imagine a man. And, you know, psychologists have drilled in to the still gendered perceptions that we hold around leadership. And they found, for example, that we think men who lead are likeable, women who lead are probably bossy and nasty and not very likeable. You know, we put all sorts of stereotypes around the women who come through. And so that makes it, I think, harder for women to combat these stereotypes, to lead in different ways, and to still have their leadership valued. And so we're in this, you know, still change process where stereotypes and structures are locking women out. And in many countries too, the intersection of money and politics speaks very loudly. And I don't necessarily mean that in a corrupt sense, though in many parts of the world there is corruption. But in, you know, lots of democracies, you referred to the United States, to be in contention, to be a leading player in the democratic system, you've got to fundraise a lot of money. And, you know, because business networks tend to be overwhelmingly male, that can be much harder for women to do, to get access to the amount of resources that would support their political campaign. So, you know, we've got to change things on so many dimensions if we're going to see women come through in equal numbers. And we can very easily overestimate the amount of progress we've made because women are very visible. You know, you can look at the world and people think, you know, perhaps during the COVID period, they think, oh, you know, who were the leaders? And, you know, people like Jacinda Ardern will come to mind, who was very noted globally for her leadership, particularly during the early, most anxious days of the pandemic. And so people look up and they see a few women leading and they think, oh, there are more and more women leaders. That's great. But actually, if we analyse the statistics, you know, we're still, when you look at all of the nations in the United Nations, so 190 odd nations, routinely the number led by women is somewhere around 20, a bit under, sometimes a little bit over, but not much over. So we haven't made the big difference where anytime you look, around half the countries in the world are led by women. So, there's much to do to change all of these things that are holding women back. And we, spend a lot of time at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership looking at those barriers and trying to come up with the best ways of shifting them.
Yeah. I'm just very glad you even sort of brought in the work of the Institute at this point, because it's beautiful to know there's that you've invested your energy into and the many brilliant women who you work with who are collecting evidence, researching, and bringing the numbers to the fore, bringing the real tangible experiences and stories and all that is needed in order to show the world how much work actually needs to be done. Basically defining that difference between the progress we've made, which is really not much in the larger scheme of things, and showing us this is the difference, this is how it's quantified, and this is how it looks like across different contexts. So we'll get to the work of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. I just thought I should pause and reflect a little bit on the words of the former Prime Minister of the UK, Theresa May, who said, female leaders are judged by a different standard. They show emotion and we are weak. Hold ourselves in check and we are cold. Julia and I are from different ends of the political spectrum. We led countries on opposite sides of the world, yet our experiences are the same. With her speech, Julia exposed the double standard with a clarity and an honesty that reached far beyond the House of Representatives, the domestic politics of the time. 10 years on, we still have some way to go, but after Julia's speech, we could no longer say we did not know. It's a beautiful set of words to reflect on. It is a confrontation to us about how much we have to do, and it's also it allows us to appreciate those of you who have gone ahead of us, gone ahead of so many, and said, this is what I can do within my small capacity, or with my capabilities and with my resources, be they few or many. This is what I'm able to do. And as you mentioned, the need to change structures, especially in, some of the biggest and oldest democracies, this is what I'm reflecting on these words to say, we could now no longer say we didn't know. Now we can identify these things, and, that just shows us how much work there, we need to do. I don't know if you have any specific reflections on those words by the former PM, Theresa May.
Yes, when Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala and I, Dr. Ngozi, wrote the Women in Leadership book, we looked at the research and we came up with the various a set of hypotheses about what it was that were holding women back, which were based on the research. But we went and interviewed women around the world, 8 women leaders, to see whether that research, fitted with their lived experience. Was it really alive in the real world of politics? And one of the things we were interrogating in those interviews was, how similar were women's experiences and how different were they? So to give you examples, we interviewed Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first woman to lead a nation in Africa, president of Liberia. And we interviewed Prime Minister Erna Solberg of Norway, and Norway always comes up in all of the rankings as one of the most gender equal countries on earth. And so you do stand back and you say to yourself, rich country like Norway, gender equal, or not gender equal, but one of the most gender equal. Liberia emerging from civil war, a lot of poverty. Can there really be anything in common between Ellen's experiences and Erna's experience? And what we actually found was, while many things were different because of the context, there was a core of things that were the same. The sense that appearance was more focused on, the sense that family structures were more focused on, the sense that even when you were in the position as Prime Minister or President, you didn't get judged by the title. It was like you had to pass a second hurdle. Yes, she's the president, but we're going to wait and hear her speak and see if she speaks well before we go, yes, she is someone to be respected. Whereas a man would walk in carrying the title of president and inherently get that respect. The sense that, you had to walk a tightrope between strength and empathy. And this is what Theresa May is referring to. If you came across as too emotional, people would conclude you were too weak to lead. If you came across as too strong, people would conclude that you were, a cold person, not a nice person. And so all of these dimensions and dilemmas we found were in play for women in very different countries and cultural contexts, which does lead me to, think that there's a lot for us to have common cause around. I mean, everybody's lived experience is different. There are intersectionalities between, gender, race, other forms of discrimination. We've got to be understanding of those. But when you get women talking from around the world, often there are lots of meeting points where their lived experience does line up and where they've been underestimated or excluded as women. And so I think that does give us a sense of global connection and global solidarity as we go about this, work of fighting for a gender equal future.
Yeah, and it's actually very important that we are reflecting on even just how to join forces, and you are already doing that. So, just in your typical trailblazer fashion, you are already doing that, joining forces with other women leaders who have done this in their different contexts and trying to compare notes, see what's working, see what can be replicated in various across our contexts, but also what isn't working and why isn't it working in terms of this fight against misogyny and how it negatively impacts our lives. So thank you really for that. I think it's interesting that you speak of two brilliant African women, and we will sort of bring this conversation now to sort of to an Africa outlook or an outlook beyond Australia as well. But before we do that, if maybe I could just bring in a question from the floor, if you're all right with that. Yeah, one of the Michelle Willink says, most of us spend and will spend a great deal of our time at work. Many of us won't be working in government or become prime ministers. Do you have any practical tips on how we can combat the daily misogyny on a smaller platform at work? It's so difficult to do without big emotion at a younger age, and passion for raising issues don't seem to help the listener hear what's being said. I'd be grateful to hear really practical things we can do on a daily basis that might bring change.
Yeah, that's a great question, and many thanks for asking it. I think whatever context we're in, we can look around us and try and make visible the gender discrimination. So, for example, in a business, it is very, very common in businesses that if you look at the intake level, round about half men, half women getting employed. And then when you look up as to who's in the middle ranks, less women. And then when you look at the top ranks, far less women. And a lot of that is to do with, work and family life barriers, women tending to not be considered for promotions when they need time for work and family life issues. And it's both the structures and the stereotypes, as I referred to it before. So getting analytical and pointing to that loss, I think, is one motivator for change. I mean, many businesses around the world consider themselves to be in a very big fight for the best of talent. And if you can point out that they're losing talented, experienced women and they could do better than that, it would be better for the business, then that might be a change motivator. Then there's, the days when something happens to you and, you're in the presence of a very sexist remark, or you feel like you've been excluded based on being a woman, and, having an emotional reaction to that, an angry reaction to that, is completely understandable. If you feel like you can call it out yourself, then do so. But I completely understand that for lots of women, particularly women who are perhaps new in that setting, perhaps a bit younger, that feels like an impossible burden. And so I would recommend, reaching out, finding the others in your setting who are, also interested in this agenda, the other women. And there can be men who are also interested in this agenda, forging links with them, because it is different if a number of people point to a problem rather than just one person pointing to a problem. And the research does show that, more people and involving men in this can be very impactful. And then I think as well, not everybody's got time to read all of the stuff. We tried to summarize, we do on the Global Institute website, try and summarize the research in the Women in Leadership book. Ngozi and I tried to summarize the research. But if you know some of that research, if you have a look at it, it does mean you can come to these conversations, making it a little bit less emotional. So, for example, if you felt you hadn't been given a fair opportunity to speak in a meeting, there is good research that shows that in groups of 5, if you get 5 people together who are trying to solve a problem, it isn't until that group is composed of 4 women and 1 man that the women get a fair share of the talking time. So if there's 2 or more men, women do not get a fair share of the talking time. And if you know that piece of research, instead of going into your workplace conversation saying, yesterday when we met, I got excluded, you can say, look, there's this really interesting research that shows, if we're not very careful, not everybody gets a fair say. And if people don't get a fair say, that could be really detrimental because very important perspectives won't end up being brought to the table. So why don't we manage this meeting on the basis that we go around and everybody gets an equal opportunity to talk? Strategies like that, which make it a little bit less confrontational by pointing to the research. And there's certainly plenty of good research out there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Those are indeed very practical steps that mental notes are being taken right here. And I cannot wait to, just try and reflect a bit more on that and maybe bring up the conversation in my own workplace. So I hope, Michelle, that you can take those with you as well and that you were taking notes yourself. And so now to Africa. We all know and we are proud of the fact that this conference, the Women Deliver Conference 2023, is happening for the first time on the African continent, in a very tiny country at the heart of the continent, which is my home country, which has its own, context, and one which you, Julia, are quite familiar with, as you've visited in different capacities. And it is a good one for us, I think, to stop and also reflect on. We all know that following 1994, which was Rwanda was a post-genocide society, internal displacement, post-genocide nation rebuilding is a huge, daunting task on the government at the time. And they had to then begin to imagine what an ideal nation for, its people, were. And of course, one of the first and most important things that Rwanda has done is be intentional about women in leadership. The statistics are currently that, 63.1% of parliamentary seats are occupied by women. That at the moment is the highest in the world. 55% cabinet seats are occupied by women, 30% are women district mayors across country. It is enshrined in the 2003 Constitution of Rwanda that 30% is reserved for women. So with the parliament having the highest number in the world of women members, and the cabinet being one of the highest, Rwanda is just a case study on affirmative action. And, given this example, what is your thoughts? What are your thoughts on affirmative action? And is it important? Do you think that it, makes a big difference? Rwanda, is, I guess, set the pace, and we can look at it and learn. Does it work? Does it not? And so in your reflections, in your own thinking, what are your views, and does it inspire the type of positive change that is needed, to elsewhere? Because it would be interesting for us to know, or for the Institute to tell us a bit more about what affirmative action does, and whether, with countries like Rwanda and others, whether it's something that should be taken elsewhere and done as well.
Yeah, I have had the opportunity to go to Rwanda on a number of occasions, and very much enjoyed my time there. Such a beautiful, beautiful country. But as you recount, a country that emerged from a real, from genocide, from horror. And the wording you used in explaining women's role in the post-genocide rebuilding, you said that Rwanda got very intentional about what women's role would be. And I just want to capture those words, because I think that's exactly the key, getting very intentional. And so we know from the research around the world that if political parties or parliaments set affirmative action targets, have some sort of quota system, then that does make change. So actually setting the goal and saying, I want my political party to select 50% women, or the parliament saying we want 50% of the representatives being women. There are obviously different models, because parliaments, democracies, countries are all different, but getting very intentional like that does make the difference. And if I can recount, the example of Australia, if you go back to the early 1990s in Australia, the progressive side of politics, the Labor side from which I'm from, and the conservative side of politics had around the same percentage of women going to the national parliament, around 13-14%. So dreadful, less than 15%. And the Labor Party got very intentional and adopted affirmative action targets, and they kept going up and up and up. And if you now look at the national Labor government in Australia today, more than half of its members are women. So that's the journey you can be on if you're very intentional. The conservative side of politics decided not to be that intentional. They had a series of informal measures, and all of these years later, they are still at less than 30% women in their numbers. So, that gap is telling you what the difference is between getting very intentional about foregrounding women and women's leadership and women's equality, as opposed to thinking, oh, well, a fraction of time will do some things, but it'll basically take care of itself. It doesn't take care of itself unless you're very active about the mechanisms for change.
Absolutely. And I think that just tells us, beyond even, space, making space and taking intentional action in, to include women, to make sure women are at the forefront and are leading and their voice is heard and, on the leadership table, it spills over into life, into daily life and the daily experiences of women. And if I just may quote, a staggering number, global statistics of women, and this is now as pertains to, the issue of women, violence against women across the world. 137 women are killed by a member of their own family every day. The largest of all women killed, so statistics, global statistics says this. The largest number of all women killed in Asia was 20,000, followed by Africa, 19,000. The Americas, 8,000, Europe, 3,000, the Oceania, 300. This was in 2017. And the greatest risk for that type of violence is in Africa, killed by an intimate family member. And I think the link between leadership, women being in leadership, being propelled forward, and the experiences of women as a result of misogyny and misogynistic experiences is that then these issues of, such staggering numbers that the global statistics tell us so brazenly. They tell us that there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done to shift the lived experiences of women across the world, especially with an issue like, violence, gendered violence against women. And so the link, you quickly see the importance of women being up there, women, affirmative action being in place to make sure that women are actually trying to do as much as they can to make sure these numbers go down, these numbers of violence go down. And so it's great for me to see that type of work is being done, and there are countries which are very intentional. There are governments and political parties that are being very intentional around how we include women in leadership and try to counter some of these difficult experiences women are having. But I now would like I think that leads us beautifully into, if I could go to the thought of intersectionality, because of course we've now talked about, leadership across contexts. You brought it down to an experience, experiences within an African context, but there's, experiences of women across the world. A leader who would have been here actually in this conversation has written in the book a chapter on intersectionality, and also share some of her experiences being while she was in Brazil. And there's all these racial, economic, social, cultural, political, religious disparities in all these societies, and you've traveled across the world, been able to experience many women. What is your view of the intersectional experience of misogyny across society and across countries?
Yes, my colleague Aleda did write a chapter in Not Now, Not Ever on intersectionality, and it's a big and potentially complicated word, not a word that might spring to people's lips all day, every day, but we're trying to understand and capture the fact that, women, everyone, comes as their whole selves into the world and navigates the world that way. And we know from lived experience and from the statistics that discrimination of various types compounds. And so people, women, women of colour, women with a disability, women from impoverished circumstances, women from the LGBT community, women come into the community space, the public space, and these sets of discriminations compound. And so when you look at statistics about, if we're analysing women's leadership, for example, and you look at the statistics and say, you know, who is underrepresented, gender is one way of looking at that, race is another way, disability is another way, sexual orientation is another way, and so the list goes on. But when you look through those statistics, you will find, for example, that Black women will be behind in access to leadership white women, and so it goes on. And so if we aren't bringing that rounded perspective to making change, then we could end up making change for a section of women, but not for everyone. And I can well and truly understand that one of the, you know, criticisms over time of you know, feminist discourse has been that it's been based on a very narrow life experience, that, you know, the discourse was led by, you know, women in more privileged, more moneyed settings with more education, very likely to be white women. And there, you know, certainly there were gendered experiences in their lives, but that didn't capture the full range of what happens to women around the world. And I think, you know, we are much more alive to that now, and bringing that certainly to the research at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. And I know, you know, in the structuring of dialogues and conferences like Women Deliver, that's also at the forefront too. And that I think is, you know, fantastic to see, and will enable us to get to better and better strategies for change, because we, you know, the more diverse the voices, the lived experience, what's brought to the table, the better the decision making.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is, of course, a question that also has come up. I'm glad I asked tonight because, you know, I just saw that Althea Ranton, thank you. She asked, you know, how has intersectionality played a role in misogyny, which you just literally responded to. And it's great to just know that the Institute is doing such amazing work and is including in its work the role the place of intersectionality in this whole conversation. And the fact that, you know, all these experiences, varied as they are, tell us that they are, you know, that there's the work that needs to be done, you know, is multi-layered, multicolored, and we need to pay attention to the different ways, the intersectional experiences of misogyny of women across the world. And I think once the Institute is paid attention to that type of, you know, those disparities and the fact that, you know, who's left behind, even as women's rights to be heard and seen and have a place at the table, who's left behind in that conversation, which, you know, what do these women look like? What are their experiences? They might seem small, but they're really big within that, you know, those women's contexts. And so intersectionality is a hugely important part of this conversation, which I think I just speak for everyone when I say a huge thank you to you and your team and to all that, you know, all the brilliant women who are putting the work in, and men who are allies and who are, you know, supporting this cause, who are putting their time and effort into researching, bringing out the evidence for this type of these varied experiences, and even, you know, telling us this is what we could do. This is what we could do at a corporate level, at a national level, society level, and you know, all that. We are coming up to you know, close to the end of this conversation, but of course I'd love for you to speak a little bit more about, you know, what the Institute for Women's Leadership is doing. You've shared a bit of it, you know, in the different platforms, but, you know, I think one of the biggest things that it's doing is, you know, it's researching, bringing evidence to the fore, and telling us these are the trends. And so again, you can tell us, you know, are the trends over time on gender equality positive or negative? What's happening in terms of what the Institute is finding?
Yeah, I think the trend is forward over time, I think things do have and do continue to change for the better over time. If I look back over my own lifetime experiences, I do think, things have changed. But I wish I didn't have to put a but in that sentence. I wish I could just say to you, yes, things are getting better. And there was no but.
Yeah.
But there is a but. And there's sort of two dimensions to the but. But the rate of change is far too slow. And, the World Economic Forum and others that measure progress on gender equality tell us that it's well over 100 years before we will reach gender equality around the world. So that's far too long to wait, far, far too long. And there's another dimension to the but. And that is, this isn't linear. It would be nice to imagine, a graph on gender equality where we're just, ever upwards, ever upwards, ever upwards, things are better. But in truth, some things get better, some things get worse, some things get better, some things get worse. There is no doubt that the COVID period and everything that came with it, lockdowns, disruption to schooling, disruption to economies, disruptions to jobs, that in many parts of the world that has caused a loss of women's rights and certainly a loss of access to schooling. For many girls who were taken out of school, they have not made a return to school and tragically are unlikely to do so. And then we talked about it before, but because, sexism, misogyny kind of has the ability to metastasize and to turn up in different ways, whilst some things have got better, the online environment particularly continues to be a shocking sewer of misogyny and sexism. And for many, and people can say, oh, well, you don't have to involve yourself in social media. But the truth is, for many occupations, for the things you do with your work, it is impossible for you to do that work unless you're connected, which means inevitably you will see, and I'm sure you do see, hideously racist, hideously sexist things coming in your direction. And, this is a very common experience for women around the world. So, going forward in some dimensions, but some problem areas that we really need to double down on. And then across the board, we need to accelerate the pace of change.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that reminder. Thank you for that, just the perspective you've shown us. And in the 4 minutes we have left, there's people that are physically in Kigali, in watching this conversation, reflecting, thinking. There's so much we haven't even been able to get into, but I'm sure they will all buy the book. I am putting them on the spot to buy the book and read and reflect. But in the few minutes we have left, what would you want the women, men, relatives, friends, colleagues, and everybody, who will follow or is following this conversation to take from this conversation, drawing from your own experience?
What I really would want people to take from the conversation is hopefully some new energy to keep working, keep advocating for change. I know it's hard, and there are some times when we do feel like, we're shouting and no one's listening and nothing's changing. But I genuinely believe, and I have seen across my years of being active as a feminist, that the combined shouting and activism does make a difference. It does make an impact. We do see positive change. And so the more we come together, the more we strive together, the better our evidence, the better our strategies, the better our sense of connection with each other, the more we will achieve.
Absolutely. Well, There you go, ladies and hopefully gentlemen. The Honorable Julia Gillard, who has so generously shared with us her experiences, her thoughts, her practical ideas and tips on how to, how to counter misogyny on our daily basis. She's painted a picture for us on what is at stake, why we need to do it. Reflect over 10 years from that misogyny speech, it is undeniable that it resonates, that work needs to be done, that speech will keep coming up in history to remind us of what we have done, what others have done before us, what we are doing, what needs to be done. And everybody, when we get together, that collective voice to speak against misogyny, it makes a big difference. It makes a difference in our daily lives, in countering violence against women, in encouraging men and men in leadership to join the chorus and fight against it. So thank you so much for all the work that you do in your own capacity, personal, in your professional capacity, and with the Institute of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London. We look forward to hearing from you again in another forum.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a great conversation. Thank you.